Hello, everyone. Welcome again to our discussion of philosophy of food. Today, we're going to continue our exploration of food justice. Specifically, we're going to focus on the second part of chapter 8 in Plakius's book, Thinking Through Food. And what we're going to do is focus on think about some of the issues relevant for distributive justice and some of the questions and challenges that arise when we're thinking about various rights, a right to food. And we'll conclude our discussion in this lecture video thinking about food deserts. So, the guiding question for right now is simply what does it mean to have a just food system? Who should be responsible for this? What would it look like to create a just food system? So let's begin then by thinking about food as a kind of basic human right. When we begin with this fundamental question, it leads us to think about access to food. If food is a basic human right, then we need to have access to it. Plakius suggests that food is much more than nourishment. And this is, I think, compatible with what we've seen from the Pollen text that we considered last time. But that's the basic central idea here is food is much more than just nourishment. It's central to everything else that we do in life. And so if you have any other sort of basic rights, a right to education, maybe a right to healthcare, it looks like a right to food, being able to have access to food, is central to any of those other things that would be necessary in order to have a good life. So treating food as a right seems to imply that every person, in some sense, is entitled to sufficient, safe, and appropriate foods, right? And this goes beyond mere charity. It goes beyond government programs. It looks like it's actually a moral and a legal claim. So then, philosophically speaking, the question is simply, well, if food is a right in some regard, well, then what obligations do you, do governments, or corporations, what obligations do we have in order to make sure that we uphold this right? Rights come with responsibilities. Rights are the sort of thing that are supposed to protect us against certain harms. They're supposed to protect our interests in some regard. So if you have a right to free speech, if you have a right to healthcare, if these things are considered foundational in some regard, well, then having such a right would protect against somebody forcing you to believe a certain thing, or somebody taking away your ability to express your opinion, or making it difficult or impossible to receive healthcare. Right? So if that's the way we're thinking about rights, if these things are foundational, then it looks like food also should be treated in the same sort of way. And I think that we can see this in the International Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which affirms a right to adequate food. And of course, in the US, we have programs like SNAP, or the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, if you will, which attempts to operationalize this right. Yet at the same point, various debates remain over whether these programs are able to fully guarantee this kind of right to food or access to food. In fact, very recently, SNAP was a big issue with the government shutdown, and whether or not individuals should still have access to these programs, even though the government is shut down. There's plenty of things that we could talk about in this regard, and there's a podcast from NPR that I want you to listen to that focuses specifically on this debate as it relates to the recent government shutdown. So I want you to think about this. If we recognize food as a basic kind of human right, then is that just meaning that we should guarantee that you have enough in order to survive? Or does it mean something else? That's something I want you to think about. And the way that Plakius describes this point in this chapter, she gives it this very nice and provocative title, Hunger Beyond Scarcity. So Plakius is pointing out here that hunger is not just about insufficient supply. In fact, that's a kind of a classic assumption that we seem to be making. Oftentimes, when we think of things like famine or hunger, we think that this results because there's not enough food that exists in order to feed everyone, right? That's why there is a problem in the first place. But notice that this isn't really quite true. Hunger often actually is the result of structural inequalities with regard to who actually has access to food, right? So we can think of Sin's entitlement theory here. Sin argued that hunger results from failures of entitlements, not necessarily from something like scarcity. Right? People go hungry because they cannot access the food that they are in fact entitled to. And that is for lots of different reasons. Maybe lack of various resources, maybe social exclusion or unfair distributive systems. Most recently, with regard to the government shutdown, it was due to political reasons, right? Political partisanship was the direct result of why people were going without their SNAP benefits. And if we consider other examples, historically speaking, like the example that Plakius offers in this chapter, the Bengal famine from 1943, in this sort of example, there was plenty of food, right? Enough food existed in that particular region, but millions still died because people simply lacked the economic means to buy food. So hunger was not caused by the fact that there wasn't enough food, right? Instead, hunger was caused because by some other sort of reason, maybe social or economic structures that were in place, people were not able to have access to the food that already existed. Indeed, this was exactly what was going on with the most recent government shutdown. It was because of social, political, economic systems, and these systems were the direct result. The failure of these systems is what gave rise to people going or living without the needed food because they didn't have access to the SNAP benefits at that point. So again, we can think about these sorts of examples where hunger exists despite adequate food supply. And think about how does this actually shift our understanding of who's responsible. Indeed, I think Plakius does a nice job of reminding us that having enough food is not always sufficient. For example, food sovereignty movements argue that communities should have control over their food systems. Not merely having the food, but control over it, right? That's what's crucial. And these would include decisions about the production, the distribution, and even things like cultural appropriateness. Food sovereignty goes beyond mere distribution in this regard, right? So we should think about it as a kind of self-determination, having a right to govern your choices, this right to autonomy and cultural relevance. And these sorts of movements ask us to consider not just the quantity of food, right, how much food is available, but who decides what is grown, where it's grown, how it's distributed throughout the communities. And again, I think interesting philosophical questions arise here. For instance, should communities have the right to reject imported or industrial food in favor of, let's say, local, culturally grown food? If so, why? And if not, why not? And it's questions like these that I think push us into a kind of deeper philosophical analysis of how exactly to think about food justice in terms of access, production, and distribution. Right? We want to emphasize that food justice is multidimensional in this regard. It's not simply, well, do I have food? Do I have enough to eat? Right? That's an essential question, but we should also be concerned with how food is produced, who benefits from such production, and who's going to bear the cost, especially when we think about entitlements, right? Should we expect someone else to provide the food for us? If I have an entitlement, if I truly have some sort of a right understood as an entitlement to food, to access to food, then does somebody else have an obligation to provide that for me? And if so, then what would be the just way to distribute that? What would be an equitable or fair way to think about that kind of system? One that would be just. So when we're thinking about justice and fairness with regard to distributive justice and things like the fair allocation of various resources, I think it'll be helpful to think about these issues in terms of the way John Rawls has described this approach. Right. So Rawls provides a kind of framework for thinking about fairness with regard to distribution. According to this Rawlsian sort of approach, resources should be distributed in ways that benefit those who are least advantaged in our society. And from this perspective, this seems to suggest that we need policies that should prioritize access for those who are the poorest and the most marginalized. Right? So let's think about the way this Rawlsian approach actually gets fleshed out. John Rawls argued that we can utilize what he calls the original position, which is a kind of thought experiment. We imagine that all of these people, these fully rational individuals in society, get together and they're going to put together what would be the just society, the most equitable, the fairest sort of social system that we can devise. And from this sort of original position, we're going to make choices on what rules would govern the society. Now, here's the catch. Rawls argued that we also need to consider what he called the veil of ignorance. And the veil of ignorance is like a blindfold, where we're making these choices without knowing anything about our own lots in life. We don't know what position we are in society, whether we have a good job, a bad job, whether we're rich or poor, and any other sort of factor that might come into play when we're thinking about making decisions for how society should be run. So this means that we're making these choices without having that knowledge. And when the veil of ignorance is lifted, we could be amongst the poorest in society. We could be the least advantaged members of this social system. And so if we're thinking about the just or fair way to create a society, what rules would govern our society, we would likely choose those rules that are going to be helpful to everyone, no matter where you are in society, no matter what your lot is in life, what your job is, or your wealth status, your social economic status, and so forth. Right. So in that regard, then, we would put into place different rules and regulations that would equally distribute things like food, which is a necessity in order to do anything else or have any of the other rights that we might have in society. Right. That seems to be a basic and sort of obvious thing. If we're thinking about what rules would be put into place in this Rawlsian approach, where we're considering the original position and making these choices from behind the veil of ignorance. When the veil of ignorance is lifted, you don't want to be in a situation where you don't even have access to food. So you're going to make decisions where everyone's going to have the same kind of equitable access to something so basic and fundamental with regard to our ability to survive in the first place, or our ability to do much of really anything else in society. Of course, we might also think about this in terms of a utilitarian approach, where we're thinking about distributing resources that's going to allow us to maximize overall well-being. And from this perspective, then, resources would likely be distributed in such a way that produces the greatest health and social benefits for the greatest number of people. Take, for instance, something like a food bank or a soup kitchen or other charitable programs that attempt to redistribute resources to those who are in need. Again, SNAP programs is crucial here, especially in our particular society. And that's why I want you to pay attention to the podcast from NPR that deals with this issue as it relates to what happens when the government shuts down. What happens when families have to make a choice between buying food for their family to keep their kids healthy and healthcare, whether or not they're going to pay for healthcare if they have a member of their family who's sick. So a question that arises here then is simply, does focusing only on distribution solve the basic issue, the basic problem? Or does it merely, mitigate the symptoms of what's essentially a structurally unjust food system? Now, with regard to all of that, it's important to point out that there are also important critiques of this kind of distributive paradigm that we need to consider as well. For instance, we might think that a purely distributive model has problems with regard to various structural inequalities that might actually make a big difference. For instance, things like food deserts, where you can go for many, many miles without having something as simple as a supermarket, where maybe the only place to get food is like at a convenience store, like a gas station, or maybe a McDonald's or something. So we certainly do have these sort of radical disparities with regard to health outcomes when we look at these sorts of places, these food deserts. And we certainly have historical exclusion from various issues with regard to land ownership. So this gives rise to questions about who gets access and who has the ability to shape the systemic injustice that's involved here, and who has the ability to actually do something about the systemic injustices that are involved. And these are important not just with regard to who has access, but also with regard to the overall quality of food, right? Even in places where food might be available, like at a convenience store, a gas station, McDonald's, like that's not really the best food, certainly not the healthiest food. So we need to think about these kinds of structural inequalities that exist in these sorts of places. But we also need to recognize that distributive justice alone oftentimes misses some of the crucial dynamics that are involved with what's going on in the food system. So, take for example, when we're considering giving food to various communities without addressing why those communities lack the economic and political power that's needed in order to have access to food in the first place, right? What kind of a lack of economic and political power reproduces various dependencies rather than empowering communities to be able to have access to good, healthy food. So, for example, in many places, in many cities throughout the United States, where we have predominantly low-income neighborhoods, in these places we have very, very few grocery stores, and mostly, again, mostly things like fast food or convenience stores or gas stations. And even though the city produces plenty of food, overall, right, there's no lack of food. Yet at the same time, people are living in food deserts where they just simply don't have access without traveling for miles. Right? So in many cities like these, where there are basically no grocery stores and so forth, redistribution does not fix the underlying structural problems that are in place. Things like zoning laws, or economic segregation, redlining. These are major issues with regard to systemic racism and some of the historical problems with inequality, and that's a part of our system itself. So philosophically, I think an important question here is simply, is it going to be enough for a food system to count as just if it's ignoring the sort of social and political and historical inequalities that are deeply embedded within the system itself? Or do we need to attack and address those issues that are at the heart of the sort of the core issue involved in access to food? And so that raises another kind of important question with regard to somebody's ability to make decisions and this kind of empowering aspect of access to food, right? Justice is not simply about access itself. It's also who gets to shape those policies, who gets to determine the production and the distribution. You know, communities should have some say in what is going on in their communities, right? Communities should have a voice in the decisions that are being made that are affecting their access to food, including what is grown, where it's grown, how it's sold, and so forth. For example, at the community level, various urban gardens might empower local residents to decide, what crops are grown, what crops are going to be maintained, what sort of cultural food traditions are we going to embrace in these communities? And this allows us to build local economies as well. And indeed, food policy councils with citizen representation often gives communities input on a city level for food regulations. And these are the things that we need to take seriously with regard to, how we're considering not just access to food, but the decision-making aspects that can empower an individual, a community, and different areas throughout our society. So again, I think there's philosophical implications that are involved here. Without this sort of community level participation, even fair distribution may fail to respect an individual's autonomy and dignity, right? Without this kind of participatory justice, which corresponds to the broader social justice theory that we've been considering throughout the course, emphasizing someone's agency and self-determination seems to be a key part in how we should approach these issues. Because it certainly does seem like we should be concerned with to what extent communities have a right to refuse maybe industrialized or imported foods that are coming through, like Cisco, for instance, which dominates most of the food industry. Or whether or not they should have access to local foods and culturally relevant options. Again, this is a point that Pollen continuously makes throughout the book, that food is much more than just the nutrients. It also involves cultural identities. And think about how all of these things are shaped by our food industry, our food system itself. Now, additionally, Placius also talks about in this chapter how food justice has various environmental costs. And that means that when we're considering food justice, we also need to consider things like ecological sustainability. Notice how our industrialized food system may provide sufficient food in some regard, yet at the same time, it may damage the environment in numerous ways. Say, for instance, through soil depletion, water pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, the sorts of things that we considered in previous modules with regard to agriculture and so forth. And notice that environmental degradation disproportionately affects marginalized communities, which raises important questions, philosophical questions about justice as it applies across different generations and different geographical locations and areas. Take, for instance, industrial agriculture in the US and how it contributes heavily to climate change. Indeed, various communities near large-scale livestock farms may experience things like polluted air and water. Anybody that lives in Nebraska probably has recognized this at some point, and this very likely produces health concerns alongside the environmental ones. Also, we can consider globalized food supply chains and how these often disrupt local ecosystems and undermine small farmers' livelihoods, say, for instance, in the global south. So, again, philosophically speaking, we can ask whether our current food industrial system should be considered just if it ensures current distribution but sacrifices environmental sustainability and the well being of future generations. We should also be considered with labor. And that's because it looks like food justice includes labor justice. Workers in agriculture, food processing, and service industries are often underpaid, overworked, and importantly, excluded from the decisions that make a direct impact on their very lives. And when we're thinking about the ethics of food production, it looks like this is going to be inseparable from the treatment of those who produce the food itself. Justice requires attention to these sort of working conditions, the wages, and the rights of these individuals. For instance, migrant workers in the US often earn below minimum wage, face unsafe conditions, and have limited labor protections, especially if they're undocumented. And indeed, this is something that's a major issue in the US right now because, I mean, people are afraid to even go to work because they might be deported or put into some sort of a camp in a foreign country simply because they're trying to make a living for their family. So again, we need to think about the philosophical implications that are involved in our current food system. Can a food system like our own industrialized food system, one that produces an abundant amount of food, can it be considered just if it exploits the very workers that are needed in order to produce all that food, right? How should labor justice interact with distributive justice and environmental concerns? So, in short, I think it's clear that food justice is multidimensional. It involves distribution, it involves participation, it involves environmental sustainability, it involves labor rights. So, when we're thinking about all this, we need to ensure that everyone has enough to eat, right? That's an important part of food justice, but that itself is not enough. We also need a system that is not exploitative and is not ecologically destructive. Now, I want to conclude this video lecture by returning to this point about food deserts and thinking about how these play out in local communities and why this really is key to understanding the structural inequalities that make a crucial moral difference in our own backyard, our own neighborhoods. So remember again that food deserts refers to the access that we have to food, right? Plakius talks about how these food deserts involve neighborhoods with limited access to affordable, nutritional foods. Indeed, the reality of food deserts is not merely an economic issue, right? It's also an ethical and a political issue. Food deserts are often shaped by urban planning decisions and transportational availability, socioeconomic inequalities. And so, in order to really truly address food deserts, we need solutions that consider both access and empowerment. We need to think about how we can include farmers markets and mobile grocery stores. I think that what's going on in New York and the ideas of having city-run grocery stores and areas that were otherwise considered to be a food desert, thinking about ways in which a community can be empowered to make food available. But at the same time, recognizing that they can't do it alone. This does involve you and me. This does involve the government. It involves all of us to really take these sorts of issues seriously. So in addition to this video lecture, I also want you to pay attention, as I've mentioned previously, to the podcast that deals with SNAP benefits during the most recent government shutdown that was produced by NPR. I think that's really helpful here. But there's also a few other videos I want you to watch in order to think more specifically about the ethics of food deserts and this particular problem as it relates to food access and systemic inequalities in our society. So that's what I want you to do for this module.